So energy is always relevant, but people
Right.
don't notice it until it's gone or it's too
Exactly.
expensive. And Israel knows that lesson very well. So Europe now has energy crisis because of the war in Ukraine. But Israel, since its establishment, has been energy poor. The need to supply energy to Israel to get energy from somewhere has always been kind of a top security priority for Israel. And finding its own energy resources has always been kind of this holy grail where the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, our first female prime minister, used to joke that we're mad at Moses because he took us in the desert for 40 years just to stick us in the only place in the Middle East that didn't have any oil. But it turns out that we have natural gas. And 10 years ago, Israel found large reserves of natural gas,
Right.
large for us, not large globally. We're talking about 1,000 BCM. Just to compare it, Russia has 44,000 BCM, right? Iran has 30,000 BCM. So it's not globally a lot, but it is regionally a lot because Israel only consumes 12 BCM every year. That might go up to 15 or 16 BCM once we introduce electric vehicles, etc. That means that we have enough gas for the next 70 years, 70. So the idea was that Israel wants to gain not just energy independence through this gas, but also sell at least half of it to gain both profit and to encourage new companies to come and look for more gas. Because the assumption is we've only found about a half of the gas reserves that are potentially in these waters.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to convince energy companies to come and look for that extra gas that might be there or might not, we need to prove that there's a market for gas, that there's someone to sell the gas to if they find it. Now, Israel is already saturated. We have enough gas for the next 70 years. If we find another natural gas field, the domestic market in Israel has nothing to do with it. So you need to prove to them that there is enough infrastructure for them to sell the gas to somewhere. So for the past 10 years, Israel has been looking for a big market to sell the gas to. Jordan and Egypt are our closest neighbors, and there are gas deals to them, but they are relatively small consumers, and it's not enough to justify more searches, more exploration. Right now, Israel has earmarked about 450 BCM for export. We've only managed to secure about a third of that to Egypt and Jordan. 2/3 of the gas that we're already earmarked for export, we can't find a seller to. So until we find a seller, preferably in Europe, a buyer, I mean, we can't convince other companies to come and look. And this is where gas becomes very tricky, because unlike oil, gas is gas.
Right.
It's much harder to transport. When you find oil, that's easy. You take the oil out of the ground, you put it in a tanker, and you ship it to whoever's going to buy it. You don't need to know who's going to buy your oil before you take the oil out of the ground. You take it out of the ground and someone is going to buy it. And even if they don't need it right now, if you give a good enough discount, then they will buy it and put it in maybe strategic petroleum reserves. There's always someone to sell the oil to, or you just put the tanker in the middle of the sea or put it in silos and wait for the price to be better. With gas, it doesn't work like that because it's gas. You need to physically connect the wellhead all the way with a pipeline, with a very expensive multi-billion-dollar pipeline, all the way from the well to the end consumer, to whoever's going to consume that gas. And until you build that pipeline, the gas can't come out of the ground. So you need to know before you build the pipeline, you need to know who you're building the pipeline to. You need to close down a customer before you can get the gas out of the ground. Now, in order to recuperate the cost of a $6-7 billion pipeline, you need to not just secure a buyer, but also get them locked into a long, binding, bilateral agreement at a fixed price for the next 10 to 15 years at least to justify the cost of this pipeline. And until you don't have this lock-in of a customer, you can't build the pipeline. The gas is just going to stay in the ground.
Right.
And this is where Israel finds it very difficult. It can't justify a very expensive pipeline in the middle of the East Mediterranean Sea to get all the way to Europe at a price that is good enough for energy companies to invest in this pipeline. Because building a pipeline, an underwater pipeline in the East Med is very, very expensive. It's very technologically complicated. The East Med is a very deep bathtub. In order to build an underwater pipeline there, you need to go 2,000 meters down to the bottom of the sea. That is the deepest, longest underwater pipeline we will ever build in the world. Keep in mind, Nord Stream 2, right, between Germany and Russia, goes 200 meters to the bottom of the sea. This will go 2,000 meters. It's humanly impossible to be that deep. So it's space technology. You need drones right? You need robotics to put the pipeline. Near Crete, the bottom of the sea is volcanic, so it moves. These are all engineering problems that make it very expensive to build a pipeline. I can't say we can't do it. We can do it, but it's going to be very expensive. And it means that someone in Greece or in Italy is going to have to commit to buy the gas for the next 10 to 15 years at a very, very high price. Now, 2 years ago, before the war in Ukraine, gas prices were really, really low in Europe, and no one was willing to buy, let's say, the estimates are $8 per MMBTU to build this pipeline. That's what Greece will have to commit to buying from Israel for the next 10 years. The average gas price in Europe 2 years ago was $2 to $4. And asking them for $8 is, no one will buy that. Now, right now, what's happening is that there's a war in Ukraine and gas prices are going up sometimes to $25 per MMBTU. But that's right now. Who's going to say that if we build this pipeline, it'll take 5 years to build the pipeline? In 5 years, there's still going to be a war in Ukraine. Prices of gas are still going to be high. It's too risky of an investment. So because of that, even with this war in Ukraine, Israel can't seem to find someone to put the money into this infrastructure. And because of this, the preferred plan seems to be liquefied natural gas.
Right.
This idea that if you can freeze gas and liquefy it, it's very, very expensive. It almost quadruples the price of the gas, but it creates a kind of like an oil market where you can just sell the gas to whoever you want. Now, until now, Europe was saturated. It had limited numbers of LNG intake facilities, right? It's not enough to just liquefy the gas. You also need that your buyer will have a regasification facility on his side to turn that gas back into gas. And so until now, most of the regasification facilities in Europe were in the West, mainly France, Spain, the UK. That doesn't help East Europe because you can't get that gas to East Europe, and that's who needs the gas. The difference now, because of the war in Ukraine, is that suddenly Europe kind of woke up to this idea that you need to pay a security premium for your gas if you don't want Russian gas. And so finally, the European Union is willing to move the private market a little to the side and willing to subsidize and put money into infrastructure that doesn't make a profit right now, but it's good in terms of security. And that means building regasification facilities in East Europe as well. So we're seeing LNG intake facilities coming up in Greece, in Croatia, in Italy, in Germany, in Poland, and Estonia. And all of that new LNG hunger in Europe that is meant to diversify away from Russia, now that it did what it did, that LNG needs to come from somewhere. And this year, or should I say last year, 2022, Europe was lucky. Europe moved from Russian gas to importing LNG. And it was lucky because there was a lot of free LNG in the market. Europe increased its LNG intake by more than 50%, from 60 million tons to more than 90 million tons last year. The only reason it could do that, the only reason that there were extra 30 million tons of LNG just sitting around waiting to be bought, was because of COVID lockdowns in China. China was not consuming LNG because of COVID. This year, COVID is gone, or at least COVID lockdowns are gone in China. And so demand for LNG in China is going to go back up, and next year even more. And that means more competition over LNG. That means LNG prices are going up. And all of that is creating in Israel this excitement that maybe the answer is just to liquefy everything. And that way, you don't need to commit to a 15-year contract with a buyer in Europe. If suddenly Europe says, we don't want LNG anymore, the war is over, we want to go back to our climate goals, then China will buy the LNG. It creates more flexibility.
Right.